you for joining us for this new version of group, which we are running as a recorded session of the most important content we would typically be delivering in week 2. This is certainly a new approach for us, as it is probably for you as well. So our plan is to just do the best we can with this, recognizing that it's a different learning format and may not work as well for everyone. We will absolutely be setting time aside next week to address any questions or concerns, and if we need to make any modifications to the group format to accommodate this change in week 2, we will certainly do so and discuss that next week. On 3 main topics today. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit more about sleep science. If you think back to the tree we presented with the different areas we're going to be focusing on throughout the group, one area was stimulus control, and we're going to talk more about that today, as well as spending some time on those sleep efficiency calculations based on your sleep diary that you kept the past week. So last week we touched on some sleep science looking at the stages of sleep. In this session, I'm going to touch briefly on the science of what is actually happening in our body and our brain that influences us to be either awake or asleep. Our sleep and wake cycles are actually driven by 2 simultaneous processes, one being sleep drive, the other being circadian rhythm. Understanding a bit about the science behind sleep can be helpful both for understanding why we're going to be working on making certain changes over the next few weeks, as well as it can help shift our thinking about sleep. So shifting out of more emotion-based thinking to being able to think about things from a rational and clearer standpoint. It would likely take a university professor and a few years for us to go through the full neuroscience and biology of sleep, but for our purposes, we're really just going to be touching on what is most relevant when it comes to understanding and improving our sleep. Touched on the concept of humans and other animals being pre-programmed with biological urges or drives. So these are motivational systems that are pre-packaged within us that help ensure that we survive. So just as we have a hunger drive to ensure that we eat, we also have a sleep drive system. So there's a lot of complex biology and neuroscience that happens in this process, but we're just going to touch on the basics today. Scientists are still trying to understand exactly how our sleep drive works, but the current science shows that the strength of our sleep drive really depends on the accumulation of a chemical in the brain called adenosine. And like most chemicals in the body, adenosine does serve a number of different functions, but its influence on sleep is one of the primary. Our levels of adenosine fluctuate over a 24-hour period. So what happens is our adenosine levels build up over the course of our time awake, and then they deplete over the time that we're asleep. If we sleep a limited amount, we're going to wake up with higher levels of adenosine than we would have normally with a full night of sleep. So that explains why if we don't get enough sleep at night, we tend to feel sleepy the next day because we haven't depleted those adenosine levels to where we really need them to be to feel refreshed. Sleep and wake aren't the only things that influence adenosine levels. So that's actually good news for us because it's some areas that we have some ability to make change. So we know that the more active we are through the day, the more adenosine is produced, especially with exercise. The other thing is consuming caffeine essentially blocks adenosine. And so that's why we feel a decrease in our sleepiness or an increase in alertness when we consume caffeine, is because it's actually acting to inhibit that adenosine in the brain. Second system influencing our sleep and wake cycle is one that you've probably already heard of before, and that's called our circadian rhythm. This is a system that's regulated by brain cells in a certain area of the brain and provides different levels of alerting signals over roughly a 24-hour cycle. It's not actually exactly 24 hours. Research shows it's usually 24 plus 9 to 12 minutes. So there is some natural drift that happens with our circadian rhythm. So not exactly 24 hours. As well as factors like gender, age, individual variation, and other factors shift that internal clock a little. So you might have some variation where some people are a little bit more inclined to be night owls versus early risers, but generally speaking, we all have this approximate 24-hour cycle or internal clock that runs within us. The circadian rhythm is not set in stone. There are a number of factors that influence that internal clock of ours, light being one of the main ones. So light influences our circadian rhythm in ways that can both be helpful or unhelpful. Exposure to daylight in morning hours is a very helpful signal to our circadian rhythm and helps regulate it, while the opposite is also the case, that light exposure in evenings disrupts our rhythm, especially with things like screens which emit blue light. The problem being that those lights signal our body and our brain to be awake and can skew that circadian rhythm. Irregular bedtime and wake times, or ignoring the body clock signals that are coming. So if we choose to either sleep when we're not feeling that tired, or the opposite, stay awake when we're feeling really sleepy, can also influence our circadian rhythm. How do these two systems actually work together in our bodies? This graph shows exactly what's happening. It looks confusing at first, but hopefully will make sense after I explain. So if you look at the bottom portion of the graph, it shows the times over the course of a day. At the top, we've got the fluctuation in our sleep drive. So that's that adenosine buildup through the day. And as you can see in the evening while we're sleeping, those adenosine levels dip and our sleep drive gradually decreases as we get a restful sleep. At the bottom, we have alerting signals. So that's those signals that are pushing up against the sleep drive that's gradually building up through our day and keeps us awake until it's time to actually sleep. As you can see on the chart, there's a couple blips on the curve. So this isn't totally a straight line in energy level and then a dip as soon as we go to sleep. There's a little bit of a dip and a rise that you can see on the energy level line. So what's happening with that? There's a point in the early afternoon where our alerting signals tend not to keep up with our sleep drive. That can cause a brief period of feeling a little bit more sleepy than the rest of the day. We often tend to incorrectly associate that time with maybe just being tired from having a big lunch, or, if a work meeting is scheduled at that time, we might just think it's because it's a boring work meeting, but there's actually something biological happening. That's where you also see some cultures that have incorporated a siesta time is to address that exact dip that tends to happen for most people. The other place we see an inconsistency in the energy level line is around the 8 or 9 p.m. mark, or a little bit later. You can see there's actually a jump in alertness. We don't exactly know why that happens, but we can describe that as the evening second wind. So something happens with those alerting signals where they get a little bit higher actually than our sleep drive, and we know that that window tends to be a really difficult time to sleep for most people. And so where that's important is if your schedule happens to be one that requires you to get into bed on the earlier end, so around that 8, 9 p.m. if you're up really early, that can make it really challenging to fall asleep because biologically there's that challenge of alerting signals being stronger than our sleep drive. The thing we're going to talk about is one of the branches on the CBT insomnia program, and that's the stimulus control. So we're going to take what we've learned about sleep science and then actually use that to work towards some behavior changes that are going to promote our better sleep. So what are we going to do for the stimulus control? We've set out 7 steps or 7 changes that we're recommending you work towards over the next week to make some change in actually what we're doing at night to get some better sleep. A few of these you might have heard of before, a few might be new, but I'm going to run through them all briefly so that hopefully it's all clear. The first one is going to bed when you're sleepy and not before your threshold bedtime. So we're going to talk about the bedtime prescription part in just a moment, but a big part of this is only going to bed when you're sleepy. So if you're feeling 100% alert, that's not a time that we want to be getting into bed. We need enough sleepiness, enough sleep drive so that you'll fall and stay asleep. And we're going to talk more about that, and I'll have a handout that explains a little bit more. But essentially, long story short, if you're not sleepy, it's not bedtime. Second, we're really working towards getting a regular threshold of rise time in the morning. So we say threshold because we know, for everyone it's not necessarily going to be exact to the minute, but we're looking for a range. Ideally, if we can keep it in about a 30-minute window is ideal. A little bit more is not the end of the world, but the closer you can keep it, the more consistent it can be, the better that's going to be for regulating your body clock. Third, getting that sunlight. So as we talked about, we know that sunlight input in the morning hours is super helpful for keeping our circadian rhythm regulated. I know that's not the easiest thing to do in the winter, and that's why some people will try a sad lamp or something like that. But even if it's not the brightest day, still getting outside for a little bit of sunlight or as much light as there is in the morning is really helpful for our circadian rhythm. The fourth is really trying to restrict the bed to sleep and sex only. The reason that we want to do that is it helps promote association in our brains of bed and sleep. We don't want to be associating bed with reading and being on the phone and, having a chat with a friend before bed. We really want to make it dedicated to, if we're getting into bed, that's for sleep or sex. The fifth step is sometimes one of the hardest ones for folks, and this kind of runs along that same idea of association. And the idea here is that you're going to get out of bed if you can't fall asleep within 10 to 15 minutes. So that holds for when you initially go to bed, as well as if you wake during the night. And so that's partially association, as well as typically we find that the longer someone stays in bed trying and forcing to fall asleep, the more frustration that tends to happen, the more unhelpful thoughts, and that's where we get into that cycle that we talked about last week of those unhelpful thoughts and emotions that can actually inhibit us falling asleep. So what do you do? So if you're having trouble falling asleep, we're not doing any clock watching. If it feels like it's been 10 to 15 minutes, get out of bed. Try to keep the lights as dim as possible. So we're not flicking every light on in the house, just a small lamp if you can. Get out of bed. If you choose to stay in the bedroom, that's fine, or if you choose to go into another room. But keeping the lights dim and choosing a really boring activity. So avoiding any screens because that's going to give that light input. Maybe either picking a book that's not the most interesting, doing a Sudoku, just picking something that's not going to ramp up your interest level, get you thinking about things and make you more alert. Maybe an old textbook or something like that. The sixth step is trying to be really conscious of how you're napping if you do take naps. So if you feel overwhelmingly sleepy, if you truly feel like you could nod off during the day, it's okay to take a nap, but we're looking to keep that nap shorter than an hour and having that nap before 3 p.m. So if you tend to get that little dip that I talked about on that graph slide at, say 2 p.m., having a half-hour nap is okay, but the later that we push it, the more that's going to affect our sleep drive when we get into bed. And then the seventh step, which we're going to get more into, is keeping the sleep diary and adjusting the plan each week, and I'm going to talk about next how we do that. We alluded a little bit last week to what the sleep diary was going to lead us to, and for most people in the group to start, the diary data is going to lead us to using some therapeutic sleep restriction. For people with insomnia, this can be one of the most powerful tools to yield change in insomnia and get you sleeping better. And so when we think about the science, given that sleep drive is what gets us to fall and stay asleep, sleep restriction increases our sleep drive to help break the insomnia cycle. So we're shortening our sleep temporarily so that the need to sleep is more intense, our bodies are more primed for sleep, and will hopefully fall and stay asleep. This does not mean that you're going to be shortening your sleep forever. The idea isn't that you're going to just have 6 hours from now on. We're going to gradually taper it based on your sleep efficiency score, and once we get better sleep happening, we're then going to start adding sleep back. So the exact process for this will go as follows. So you've already kept, hopefully, your sleep diary from last week. What we're going to be doing is determining your average night of sleep, and there's two ways to do that. You can either informally pick which night of that week best represented your overall. So if you varied between getting up 2 to 3 times a night, you maybe had one night where you're up once, one where you're up 4, pick a night that had that middle ground of everything. Or if you're a person who likes things to be really specific, you like data, you can actually just calculate your sleep efficiency for each night of the week and then take the average of the 7 days from those percentages. So how do we actually get that percentage? What you're going to do is you're going to go into this website that I've got listed through the My Sleep Well website, and that's a sleep efficiency calculator. It's really straightforward, and I'll show you on the next slide. You're going to enter in your numbers, and you're going to get a sleep efficiency score. And what that score means, that percentage means really the quality of your sleep. It tells us where are things at right now. We're going to use that score to then make a plan for whether we need to implement some sleep restriction. For most starting out, it starts out as sleep restriction and then we add sleep back, but depending on the person, we might even start with adding sleep back. This slide shows just an example of what it might look like when you fill out the sleep efficiency calculator. So as I said, this could be filling it out based on what your most typical night was over the course of the week, or you may enter in these numbers for every single day and then average out the 7 percentages that you get. So you're just going to go through and enter exactly what you wrote down on your sleep diary. So those same questions that are listed right on the page that you have, you're just going to input that in, and you're going to click the blue calculate button. Once you click that, scroll down a little bit. It may not be visible in your browser unless you scroll down. It's going to spit out the calculations for you. So you can see on the right-hand side, in the example that I've got shown here, this person had 10 total hours in bed that night because they got into bed at 9 p.m. and got up at 7. Their total time awake was 4 hours. So between the time that they spent in bed not trying to sleep, as well as the awakening time, that takes into account that total time awake in bed. And as a result, we then have this sleep efficiency score of 60%. Sleep efficiency score is what we're going to use to make the sleep prescription. And if you scroll further down on that calculation page, it is going to show you this graph, but you've got it here for reference as well. So if your sleep efficiency score is below 85%, we are going to start implementing some sleep restriction. So your new prescribed bedtime is going to be 15 minutes later than what it was the previous week. And this is where trying to keep that consistent bedtime and wake time is really important, because that's how we can then implement this sleep prescription. So if you're under 85%, you're going to push your bedtime, tough it out for 15 minutes later to start upping that sleep drive. If you had a great week and your sleep score was in the 85 to 89% range, we're not going to touch it. That's looking, at an area that we're not too concerned about. If your sleep efficiency score was higher, so 90 and above, that may indicate that we should make some change. And the key is whether or not you feel rested. So what's going to happen over time is, as we reduce your time in bed, your sleep efficiency score is hopefully going to improve, but it's probably not enough sleep. So for example, we may get to the point that you're only sleeping for 6 hours, a good 6 hours, but 6 only. And so we know that we need to start increasing that. So once we hit a good sleep efficiency score, we're going to work towards adding time back. That being said, if someone gets a perfect night's sleep, they might go to bed, say, at 10 p.m. and get up at 7 and feel completely refreshed. They'll get a score probably in the 95 plus, but we don't necessarily actually have to change the bedtime to be earlier because they're feeling rested. So the key is, if your score is in that 90 plus range, if you feel rested, don't make a change. If you don't feel rested, we're going to be adding a little bit of sleep by making an earlier bedtime. For most people, as I said, though, we're going to be looking at that sleep restriction of 15 minutes later. As I said, I'm going to have a handout that explains a little bit more with those sleep calculations if there's anything that you're not sure about. But essentially, that's really the big thing that we're focusing on is setting your sleep prescription for the next week and following that, completing a new sleep diary. We're also going to be continuing on with that breathing that you did last week. Next week, we're going to add a few new exercises in for you to practice. You're going to be also implementing those 7 steps to solid sleep. So we're doing the stimulus control, the new prescription for your bedtime, and maintaining the sleep diary. As I said, there may be questions. If any of this feels unclear, we will clarify everything next week. But please do the best you can with following your new sleep prescription by doing those calculations and starting a new sleep diary, as well as really working on those changes for those 7 steps to solid sleep. Those steps might feel really easy. There might be a couple areas that are a real challenge for you. Do the best you can and take note of where you're struggling, because we'll work together as a group next week to figure out how you might make that work for you.